Okay, I think I'm recording. And welcome to After Effects Assignment 5. Tonight, we're going to start working in After Effects 3D. So we're going to be working with 3D layers, cameras, lights, shadows, all kinds of crazy stuff. And let's get started. So we're going to start a new project. We're going to start a new composition. I'm going to make my composition 1080p 24. So HDTV 1080p 24, 1920 to 1080, 24 frames per second. I'm going to set this to half resolution just so that we're previewing it half straight away. And 10 seconds is just fine for what we're doing right now. Okay. So I think what I'm going to do here is we're going to build our assets and then put them into 3D space and kind of start playing around with how you can use how you can start building a shot within After Effects that's got some interesting 3D effects added to it. Or we could, you know what, screw that. Let's have a little bit more fun with this. I actually saw a really cool video a while back that I thought would be really fun to kind of recreate inside of After Effects 3D. So let's do this. Let's everybody run out to Google real quick, and we'll pull in some assets to work with. Obviously, I said in the assignment that you're supposed to be using stuff that you're creating. For the specifics of this lecture, we're just going to grab some stuff just because it's easy. I'm going to go over to google.com and we're going to go into images. So I'll pull that over here. I'm going to just type in newspaper texture. So I'm going to get images for newspaper texture. Let's find, ooh, this one's good, high resolution right here. Just find one that's got some good resolution. Like if you type in exactly what I have, newspaper texture, you'll see this one right here that's 6,000 by 4,900, which is nice and large and high resolution. I'm going to go ahead and view that image. This will work great for what I want to do here. Let's right click this. Save that image as. I'm going to go ahead and on my desktop and in my folder, create a new lecture folder here real quick. This is week 6, assignment 5 lecture. Create that. And I'm just going to create another folder called textures. And then I'm going to save that newspaper texture JPEG in there. Does everybody have a JPEG they can use? All right, so we're going to learn some new techniques tonight. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go get some stuff that we can use for mats. And I'll talk more about mats here in a second. I'm going to do tree outline images. Perfect, like stuff like that is great. This is great right here. If we can find some that are a little higher resolution, that would be cool. Let me go more. Let me go tools. I'm going to look for larger ones. Oh, yeah, that's good right there. So just something like this is perfect. It's got a clear black and white border on it. You could use something like that too. Let's pull in a couple of them just to have kind of fun with this. I'm going to pull this one in. Oh, that one's got a watermark on it, so we're going to skip that one. Ooh, how about the palm tree? That's also got a watermark on it. How about this guy right here? Does this have a watermark on it? Doesn't look like it's a very good. That's 170 by 170. So basically what I'm looking for is I'm looking for something that's just got a nice stark black and white outline on it. And isn't...
Could it be a PNG?
Yeah, that's totally fine. I'm going to try tree clip art black and white. Oh, they're all watermarked, for gosh sakes. Ooh, that'll work. So I'm going to pull in, so look, and you guys don't need to use trees. You can really use whatever you want for this effect. I'm just going to try to layer some things up and move the camera in 3D and give it an interesting look. So I'm going to pull in this black and white image that I've got here. I'm going to save this image as. I'm going to save this into a new folder called tree images. And I'm going to save this first one. And there were some options that I had for a few more. So I'm going to just look at a couple more of these. See if there's anything that works. I kind of like this one right here, but it's got watermarks on it. Oh, usage rights. Labeled for reuse. There we go. I'm going to grab this one too. This looks pretty good.
Looks cool.
Yep, that'll work well. So just get like 2 or 3 tree black and white tree images.
Or anything, right?
Or anything you want. I mean, you can do this technique pretty much with anything. I like the trees because once we start throwing lights at it, they cast really interesting shadows, things like that. I'm gonna grab one more and call it good. That looks great. We'll do that one. This will be tree image 3.
Does it have to be an outline of something, or
You just want it to be stark black and white so that we can use it as a mat on our newspaper prints.
All right.
Or it can be on alpha too. We can use mats with alpha as well. All right, so does everybody have a newspaper and a couple of black and white images to work with?
Definitely.
All right, because now things are going to get crazy. Okay, so let's bring those images into After Effects.
Does it matter if they're PNG versus the JPEG?
Nope, anything will work. And I need to go back and get my newspaper, which is upper texture. There we go. I'm straight away going to do a little bit of organization. Going to have my tree images and my newspaper textures kind of put in folders so that I know where things are. There we go. I'm going to call this main comp. And everybody with me.
Definitely.
Do you guys? Anybody need just a minute more? Have any questions? Have any trouble pulling down stuff to use? I want everybody to be ready to go. Everybody's ready to go? All right, last chance. No more questions? Here we go. Okay, so let's start just simply with our first texture, which is this awesome super high resolution newspaper texture. So let's take that newspaper texture and put it onto our timeline. You can see it's really high resolution, which is great. Let's just leave it just the way it is right now. So the start of After Effects 3D is really just turning layers into 3D layers so that they work in 3D space. And the way that you do that is with this little switch right here. So when you're looking in your timeline, you've got, obviously we've talked about motion blur, how to make stuff motion blur. You got that little switch. Well, 3D works the same way. So there's a 3D switch on every layer. Go ahead and click that 3D switch. And at first it looks like nothing has happened. But if you say hit P for position, you'll notice now you have 3 parameters for position. You've got X, Y, and Z. So now you can move things around in Z space. You also, if you push S for scale, you've got 3 scales. You've got X, Y, and Z scale. Now, we're working with flat images, so scaling things in Z scale doesn't really make a lot of sense. But they are there. So that's a good way to make sure that you're actually working in 3D space. Let's go ahead and hit rotation, and you'll also notice that we have X, Y, and Z rotation. So now instead of 2 parameters on everything, you've got 3 parameters on everything, and it's going to allow you to move these things around in 3D space. So let's take this newspaper, and what we're going to do is we're going to rotate it 90 degrees, and we're going to make it the floor or the ground of our shot. So, and I believe we want to do this on the X-axis. So I'm going to take the X rotation axis, and I'm just going to set this to minus 90 degrees, and it should look like this, which means we're looking at the layer straight on from the side. So we're seeing this now from the side instead of really up close. And if we take and then go into our position parameter and move this down on the Y-axis, you can see we can kind of create a floor or a ground plane with which to work on. So you should have something kind of like what I have right now. You guys with me? Do I need to go over any of that again?
Sorry, how do I get to the X, Y, and Z for?
So R for rotation, or you guys can just open up the parameters too. Like if you don't remember the letters or whatever, just open up the transform parameters and you can start working with the transform parameters there. So I move this down in position on the y-axis so that it kind of becomes a ground plane. You can see that that nice high resolution's working well. I've got kill looters in the foreground, which is fun. Shoot to kill by order, cool. Okay. The scale is at 100%. We're going to kind of leave this the way it is. So we've got a ground plane with which to work with. The next thing that we're really going to need to like really make the most of our 3D space is we need a camera. So let's go up to layer. Make sure you have your composition selected before you do this. Layer, new, camera. And you should see the camera settings dialog pop up like this. So let's go over this camera settings dialog a little bit so you can get a better understanding of what this means and how you can work with it before you ever really create a camera. Now, most of the time, I'm generally, when I create a camera, I use a 2-node camera, 50 millimeters, and I'm good to go. But let's step through and just take a look at what we got. So in the upper left-hand corner, you've got a type dialog box. You've got 2-node or 1-node. Anybody got any guesses in terms of what that might mean? Those of you who've worked in 3D programs might know. Okay, so 2-node camera means that you can control the camera and a point of interest. So you can control where the camera's looking by just moving the point of interest around. Or you can rotate, position, scale, or move your camera itself. So you've got two pieces with which to work with. If you use a single node camera or a 1-node camera, that is just the camera by itself. So now it's unconstrained by a point of interest. You can rotate the camera in any direction and make it look wherever you want it to go. Both of them are useful. Sometimes it's a good idea to have a single node camera, especially if you're moving the camera over long distances inside your After Effects comps. Other times it's really helpful to just have a 2-node camera where you can control where the camera is looking and move the camera around that point of interest. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with the 2-node camera. So we're going to use a 2-node camera. You can name your cameras. You can have multiple cameras in a composition where you can create multiple shots or angles within the same 3D space, which is really cool. So you can have a camera on for say like 2 seconds and then cut to another camera in a different position, shooting a different shot or a different angle or a different focal length, which is really cool. So this starts to get into the kind of virtual camera shooting stuff, which is awesome. Preset, obviously these are focal lengths of the camera. So you do, like, these cameras work like real cameras in the real world. They have focus distance, focus lengths, they have depth, focal lengths, they have depth of field, all the things that kind of a real camera would have. 50 millimeter is fine to start. You can change your focal lengths inside of the camera whenever you want. You can zoom in, zoom out. There's all kinds of neat stuff that you can do with it. If you've ever wanted to create like the perfect Hitchcock effect, you can do that really, really easily inside After Effects because you can push the camera and zoom the camera at the same time, and it's all fully controllable, which is awesome. So I'm going to go with a 50 millimeter camera and click OK. A lot of this other stuff is really just telling you what the arbitrary numbers are, like what the film size would be. Well, we don't really care too much about that. I don't think I've ever changed those parameters inside the camera settings. It also kind of tells you your angle of view so that it fits the comp. So when you create a camera, what's going to happen is it fits the camera's angle of view to your comp when you start. And it doesn't matter which focal length you use. Like if you change the focal length to say like 20 millimeter, that angle of view will change, but it will fit perfectly to the edge of your comp. So I'm going to stick with 50. Down on the bottom, you've got the units that it's working in, millimeters, and the film size measurement. Like I've never really had to change any of this stuff. Not too important as it stands right now. You can enable depth of field straight away if you want to. I don't advise doing that. Depth of field takes a lot of render cycles, so I generally only turn on depth of field when I want to specifically see the effect or start previewing a final shot. And oftentimes I'll turn it off to preview like camera movement to make sure things are moving right, so that I can check animation, and then I'll turn all that other stuff on and check it later. So I'm going to leave that unchecked. and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. It looks like nothing has changed, but now we are looking at the composition through the camera, not just looking at an arbitrary view in our comp. We know that this is the case if we get into those parameters. So if you push P on your camera, you get a position parameter. And if you start sliding that position parameter around, you will see that we are indeed moving the camera in 3D space. Everybody with me? Everybody's got a camera? Okay, cool. So now we have a camera. So let's look at a few of the different options that we have for kind of moving the camera around, right? So like I said, we've got a point of interest and we've got a position. So the position is the camera itself. The point of interest is what the camera is looking at. So if you take that point of interest and you move it around, you can see that the camera pans left and right. So now you can use the point of interest and animate the point of interest, kind of almost like you're working with a tripod, right? You can move the point of interest up, down, left, right, closer to the camera, farther away from the camera, whatever you want the camera to be looking at, you can set that point of interest up to make it look where you want it to look. Position we already went over. You can move your camera left, right, up and down, and you'll notice that wherever you move that point of interest, that is always where your camera will be looking. I'm going to kind of back up just a little bit to get this back to the stock settings.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah, shoot.
So the point of interest is basically the anchor point?
Kind of, yeah. So it's like, so like let's say I look at your head, right?
Uh-huh.
Your head is now the point of interest of my eyes, the cameras, right? They're focused on a single point.
Yeah.
And I can move that point around just by where I focus my eyes, right?
Gotcha.
So think about the point of interest almost like what your eyes would be locking on, right? Go ahead, David.
Are we able to see like any visuals of where that point?
Yes, yes, and I'll show you that in just a second. Perry, go ahead.
Let's say that we have like a medium or so shot of a person.
David had a question about can you see where the camera is in 3D space, and the answer to that is yes. So oftentimes when you're working within 3D space, you're going to want to use more than one view to see what you're looking at. Any of you who've worked within a 3D program before know that oftentimes you have a perspective view, you have a left view, a top view, a right view, whatever. You're looking at multiple views so you can see where everything's oriented in 3D space. And After Effects is no different. So if you're in the main comp window here, and you go down to the bottom, you can see that we are indeed looking at the active camera, right? So if you click on that, you'll notice that you have camera 1, front, left, top, back, right, bottom, custom view 1, 2, and 3, right? So at any time you can change this view to a different view. So let's say we go to the top view. All right, so I went to the top view. I can't see much, but if I zoom out, you can see both the camera and the layer that we're looking at, right? And oftentimes when I'm working inside of After Effects, I don't even worry about what I'm actually seeing in this little box, but I'm more concerned with where all these layers are in 3D space and where my camera is in 3D space and how it's moving, right? So once you start animating, it'll actually give you like the same thing you get whenever you move a shape layer, right? You have that little animation line that shows you how the shape is moving across the screen. You have handles, things that you can grab on to control the motion paths. The camera's the same way. All right, so you can use different views. Now, if you want to see both views at one time, you can do that as well. So I'm going to set that top view back to active camera, which is going to give me my initial shot, right? And then if we click on this view button over here on the right-hand side, you can see that you can have up to 4 views. So you can set it up so that you have 4 views. Now I've got 3 reference views on the left, which show me the front view, the right view, and the top view, as well as my active camera or perspective view, right? And anything that you do with the camera, you can see in those views. So if I take my camera and move it around or change the point of interest, you can see where the point of interest is in 3D space, which is super duper helpful. I don't generally work with 4 views. Usually when I work with After Effects, I'm only working with 2 views, right? So I'll have like a top view or a left view that I can change to different views whenever I want. So like if I want to change this to a custom view and look at it however I want, that's something that I do often. So the custom views are cool. So the next thing we kind of need to know about is like, well, how can I work with my camera a little bit more fluidly, right? And the C button is the magic for cameras. So if you push the C button, it's going to turn your cursor into a little camera, and this will allow you to move your camera around in 3D space. I don't recommend animating with this button, but when you're working with different views, especially the custom views, it's super helpful. So like if you push C once, it will rotate your camera around in 3D space. If you push it again, it will pan the camera left, right, up and down. And if you push it a third time, it'll truck the camera in and out. Really, really great for custom view working. Top, left, right, front, back, all those views are locked. So really the only thing that you can do with those views is truck them in and out, right? So let's say if I go to a left view over here on the left-hand side, if I'm on just the normal camera, you can see that I get the blinky blinky sound and it won't let me do anything. But I can truck the camera in and out from that view. So I can see my camera here. I can see my point of interest. I can see the layer that it's set up on. It gives you a good idea or point of reference to see how things are moving around inside of 3D space. Okay, is everybody still with me? Cool. All right, let's push forward, shall we? So we've got a camera. We're able to animate position, point of interest, things like that. Awesome. You know how to use the views and kind of look at your camera. I'm going to go ahead and just set this back to one view, which is just my initial camera. And we're going to start populating this with some more 3D layers. And that's where our trees come in. So let's do this. Let's take our trees and let's just take one of your trees and let's just drag and drop that onto a new composition. Right? So did you see how I did that, everyone? I just took my tree and dragged it down onto this little composition icon to create a composition that fits the resolution, height, and width of my image. So do that with whatever image you have. Everybody good? Everybody with me? All right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our same newspaper and we're going to create a cutout of this black and white image from that newspaper. So let's take our newspaper and drop it in below your clip art. Right? So you're not seeing it. If I shut my clip art off, obviously I can see the newspaper, right? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my newspaper and I'm just going to scale it down so we've got a little bit more texture inside of our image. So it kind of looks like this now. You guys all still with me?
Do that one more time.
Yep. Sorry, Joe?
I'm stuck on the camera thing, the C key.
Oh, how do you move it?
No, how do you get rid of it?
You can just click on, like, you can push V for the move
Oh,
tool.
okay.
So click on any other tool and it'll bring you out of the camera view. All right, so everybody make sure you're with me because we're going to do a new technique here. So I want to make sure everybody's on top of it. Everybody's got a newspaper and a black and white image, correct? Clay, you're good? All right, awesome. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Now we're going to use the matting feature of After Effects. So matting is an awesome tool. I use it all the time for all kinds of different stuff, which is great. Those of you who hung around with me on the first day when I was doing my little Battlestar Galactica thing, I kind of played with matting a little bit there. But this time we're going to use it to great effect. All right, so we have our clip art. We'll turn our clip art back on. So I just clicked the visibility button on it. And we've got our newspaper in the background. So down on the bottom, click Toggle Switches Modes. And you're going to see a section now. You've got modes, obviously, which are the blending modes, which we've worked with before for like layering up particles and things like that and creating some different looks. And you've got the section called TRK Matte. That's Track Matte, right? So with track mats, what they do is they work off of Luma, which is black and white, or Alpha, which you guys know is transparency, right? So if you have an image that's, say, a PNG that's on Alpha, you're going to want to use the different Alpha modes of the track matting. If you have a black and white image like a JPEG, like I have right now, you're going to want to use the Luma versions. So I'm going to click on my track mat, and I'm going to do Luma Matte, and just check out what I got. Okay, so that's not exactly what I want. I'm going to go Luma Matte Inverted. And now I have this beautiful paper kind of textured tree in the background. And you'll notice that it is on Alpha, which is exactly what we want. So it creates a really interesting effect straight away.
So
Go ahead, David.
Is a then just a mask kind of going upwards versus downwards? Like, is it kind of, or no?
I'm trying to figure out what you mean by upwards
so
versus
when you,
downwards.
Like, if you mask.
Oh, in terms of the layer stack.
Like, yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of like if you had masked the layer above it, except you're masking kind of the layer
Right, so that can be a little bit tricky with track mats. So the way the track mats work is the texture that you want to use goes below what it's actually looking at to mat, right? So whenever you do any kind of work with matting, you want to make sure that whatever you're using to create your mat is above the layer that you're actually matting, right? If it's not, it's going to freak you out. You're going to have all kinds of weird stuff happen, and you're going to want to hate yourself a lot. So that's really important to know. So thanks for asking that question. So yes, it indeed does go above the layer that you're matting to. So when you say track mat here, it's looking at the layer above, and you'll notice that the visibility is turned off now, right? And that's exactly what we want. So now we have this really cool like black and white paper textured outline, which is great. So I'm gonna do just a little bit of tweaking here. It looks like I got this border on the edge that I just want to get rid of. I just want it so you can see that little black border right there. You guys might not have this problem on your stuff. I'm going to move, just scale this up ever so slightly so that I don't have that black border, and it should be on alpha, which it indeed is. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use that composition in our 3D comp as an element. All right, everybody with me?
Definitely.
Your trees are working, your mats are working. Anybody have any issues? Everybody's good to go. All right, so here we go. So I have my black clip art thing. I'm going to call this, just for my own sanity, tree with birds. And we're going to take that composition and we're going to dump it into our 3D setup. All right, so we've got our first like little tree laid out on our composition. We need to make that tree or that layer a 3D layer. So make sure you click the 3D on it, and it will indeed become a 3D layer that you can move around in X, Y, and Z space. Everybody still good?
Is it draft 3D?
What was that, Perry?
Is it draft 3D?
He's louder, buddy.
Draft 3D.
What about it?
Like, you say make it a 3D layer, right?
Yeah, so you click that little switch to make it a 3D layer. That's super important.
Gotta go to your composition. Track right, the very first one. Drop the nail in the tree composition.
Does everybody have a layer in 3D space above their paper ground? Yes?
Not above.
This is one.
It's kind of big.
That's
So if you guys have regular trees, yours are probably going to look more like this. Let's see if I can rotate it the right direction. So you'll notice right away, and I'm gonna do something just to help me out a little bit here. I'm gonna add a hue saturation effect to my ground newspaper, and I'm just gonna take a little bit of the lightness out of it so that I can see where my tree is on my 3D ground plane. So if you guys are having trouble kind of differentiating where your tree is, you can use that as a kind of a trick. So what I'm going to do, like you guys probably want to do something like this, right? You've got your tree in 3D space. You've got your ground in 3D space. What you kind of want to do is you want to butt this up to the ground so that it actually makes contact with it. And then you can kind of control where you want to put it in 3D space. I'm going to make mine kind of come out of the side of my shot because I'm going to kind of focus on these birds with the little hearts coming out of them, but we're going to populate this space with a few more trees too. So is everybody with me?
How did you make the hue?
So to do the hue saturation thing, I'm going to back up a little bit. All right, so I clicked on my ground plane, my newspaper, right? Type in hue and effects and presets.
Oh, okay.
And then just drop hue saturation on my newspaper and just pull the lightness back a little bit so it's a little easier to see where your trees are sitting.
It's not showing me. Rotate hue saturation. Yep. Then put it on the newspaper.
Yep. And then just pull
Where's
lightness
this
back.
Go to your effects.
There you go.
Not too much. Make it about half.
Just type into it.
So this is just a helper right now. We're not going to use that hue saturation to differentiate where the tree is, because once we get into lights and shadows, all that stuff is going to start to pop, and it's going to make a lot more sense where things are in your 3D space. All right, so let's take the next step here. So in terms of what I'm looking to do with my shot here is I'm going to kind of move my my ground plane down a little bit, because I want it to feel like the camera's kind of up in the branches, right? And I've got my layer right here. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, I apologize if you already answered this, but like
Nope,
for
no
the
problem.
Orientation attribute, is
Yep.
there anything wrong with like using that versus the XYZ attribute?
Excellent question. I tend to stay away from orientation because all of those parameters are locked together. And oftentimes you're going to want to individually rotate something. And it can get really confusing if you're using both orientation and rotation at the same time. So my advice is to stay away from orientation. It's not to say that it can't work for you. I just find that for my own personal sanity, I like keeping things compartmentalized if I can. And it especially comes into play when you're working with the camera, because orientation is also on the camera itself. And if you start playing with orientation and rotation and all those different parameters, like it's going to start to get crazy really fast. So I tend to take the keep it simple, stupid methodology to working with cameras in After Effects. And if it needs to be complex, that's where I go to SureTarget. Okay, so everybody's got at least one tree in, right? And a ground, and you're able to move things around in 3D space. Damien?
My ground is not here.
Not here. Or did you double click on something by accident? Just make sure you're in the composition panel.
Yeah.
Go to the other compositions over here. See your composition right there. Your ground's right there.
Okay, so we got some view issues. Let's set this to one view. So where it says 2, set it to 1.
Alright.
Right? Make sure active camera is selected.
And you have to drag the other composition into this composition.
Yep, and you gotta drag your tree comp down there.
That makes sense.
And it can go, yep.
Okay. I'm good.
Yeah, see,
All right.
it
You're
comes
right there.
This one's a little tricky. Because I would, let's go back into that comp and fix it real quick. You're gonna have to, I would recommend masking the outside of that out, or inverting the mat. So, yep, go in there, and then, okay, so let's do this too. The composition side isn't right. So I'm gonna come over and give you a hand for a second, Damien.
Okay.
All right, so here's what I recommend, you guys. Take your other tree images and go through the same workflow. So create a composition, bring your tree in and your newspaper, mat them together, and then bring those subcomps into your 3D space and start playing around with them in 3D space and arranging some trees and creating a little newspaper forest out of this.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so here's what we need to do, Damien. We're going like this. We're going to...
Yeah, you must have gotten really small images.
Okay, so that's your main comp. Okay, comp 1 is your tree. So what I'm going to do is delete this. And one of the steps that you just missed was making sure that it's the same size. So let's take which tree were we working with? This one right here. All right, and then this is what you want to do. Drag this onto the composition window, and it creates a composition. Make sure it makes it the same size, right?
3D.
Okay.
And then you bring your newspaper down.
Transform.
Scale that a little bit. So you can see. Oh, you just did not say the 2 words. That's fine too. That's all right, and then we're going to match this. Let's definitely Lumamat. Let's go Lumamat inverted, and then you get this nice tree outline that's in paper. And then the kind of fun things that you could do to this is you could colorize it, make it green or red or whatever color you want. Kind of dress it up a little bit, but that's going to look a lot better than a big box, right?
Yeah.
And then come back in here, drop your tree outline into your setup, scale it a little bit, and I would also recommend doing a saturation for the bottom layer, just so you can kind of see where things are. You can see that it's intersecting your paper down there. So we'll lift up your tree outline a little bit so that it's going to hit the bottom right there. And now you can kind of just scale it, play around with it a little bit, make it work the way it wants.
Okay.
Cool, that one looks great. Good, good, good. Yeah, you guys are killing it. All right, all right, all right. I like what I'm seeing. Cool, 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 cool. Awesome. Okay. All right, so let's get a couple more trees into our composition, then we're going to start playing with lighting and shadows. So I'm going to run through the same type of thing right here, right now with my other images. So I got tree image 2. This one looks to be on alpha. And it indeed is. Bring in my newspaper. I'm using an alpha matte this time. And there I've got my nice tree looking good. I'm going to just kind of change and position my texture a little bit so that it looks good. There we go. Gonna run back to my main comp and drag that new tree image in, make it a 3D layer, and I'm gonna kind of move it around in 3D space and position it so that it looks good. Cool. I'm going to do the same thing with my tree 3. Created a composition from it. It is again in alpha. Bring in my newspaper. Use the track matte. I'm using alpha this time, and I need to use alpha matte. I'm going to scale my newspaper a little bit so that I've got some nice texture on it. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to do the same thing I did before, run back to my main comp, and drag on my third tree image, make it a 3D layer, and kind of position it in 3D space. I'm going to move this one a little closer to camera, I think. And just for fun, what I'm going to do, and you guys can do this too if you want to, I'm going to make some duplicates of my trees and just kind of create a little forest, a little happy newspaper forest.
Does this not work on text?
How do you mean? Which technique?
I'm trying to do basically this, but just with a text layer, and it's not doing that when I change it to alpha inverted or luma inverted. None of them make it so it's got that kind of blending mode.
Do you have a let me see what you got, Cole. Shut the visibility off on your text. There you go. Perfect.
Cool. Thanks.
Good, good, good. Stuff's looking good. David,
Can you show
question?
him how to do manipulate like the camera if you want to, just to be able to look around, like
Yeah,
besides like top horizontal.
Yep. So let's use a custom view. So you can say go from active camera to custom view 1, and then just use your C key to select different versions of the camera so that you can kind of rotate it, truck it in, truck it out, pan it left and right.
How again do you truck it out?
So I'm just using the C key, right? And you can see how the icon changes.
You
So
just press it each time.
yep, you just press through it to cycle through the different options.
Gotcha. Thank you.
No problem. All right, so it's pretty cool. We got this looking pretty good, right? We got some trees in our little happy forest. And this is nice because you can come in here, kind of like what David was doing or was asking about. You can come in and you can use these custom views to really help you orient objects in 3D space rather quickly. So like I can select stuff, duplicate it, make additional versions of some of my trees, throw them in 3D space. You can move them up, down, left, right. I'm going to go back to my active camera and just kind of play with some of the scales and things. Kind of create some bigger trees and some smaller trees. All right, so what's one thing that we're having trouble with right now?
Getting the layers in the correct order.
Well, and they all look like they're blending together, right? Like there's no depth perception here. So let's do a little bit of playing around with our camera. Let's go ahead and turn depth of field on. So go into select your camera, turn the caret down, and you'll notice you have both transform options and camera options. So and you'll notice when you go into camera options, you have a ton of camera options. And all this stuff is animatable. You can zoom the camera in, zoom the camera out. You can turn depth of field on and off. You can change your focus distance, your aperture, blur levels. There's a bunch of stuff in here. So straight away, let's go ahead and just turn depth of field on. And right away, it doesn't really look like it's done anything, right? Now, what do we need to do when we want more depth of field with the camera?
In the aperture.
Open the aperture.
More depth field closed, but shallower.
Shallower depth of field. Yep, that's what we're looking at, right? We want to open up, right? We want a nice big open iris, right? So let's do that with the aperture. So with aperture, it's the opposite of a normal aperture. Normal apertures are the smaller the number, the larger the actual opening of the lens, right? With After Effects, it's the larger the number, the larger the aperture. So let's take the aperture in terms of pixels and just crank that up. And you'll start to see everything kind of blur out, and you'll notice you get this beautiful depth of field effect. And now we can see that initial layer that I dropped in there is starting to pop quite a bit, which is exactly what I want.
I had a question. I get like, when I turn the depth field on, I get like a gradient all over my screen.
Oh, interesting.
It could be that your focus distance is set really, really close to
They
the
want that
camera.
depth of field thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, camera. And then
Oh,
camera.
that's crazy. Go ahead and turn it on.
And then turn depth
Yep,
of field on.
yep. So you'll notice that your focus distance is set to 0 pixels.
Okay.
So what's happening is it's trying to focus like right here. Like if your eye and you're trying to focus on your finger,
Right.
that's the same effect that's happening, right? So let's do this. I like to, let's set this to 22,667. Okay, so now you can kind of see, if we go to say top view, you can see where your camera is, and you can also see where the focus distance is. I'll go over this for the people, right? So it was set like right here, and you want it to be set out here where your other layers are, right? Now when we go back out, the actual camera, punch in a little bit, and we crank up the depth of field, you can see that you're now able to see that depth of field working. Barry, you got the depth of field working?
It's odd.
It's on. You gotta crank that aperture number up. Keep going. Go nuts with it. There you go. Now you can see it. You see that line of focus right there? Now move your focus distance around.
So that'll only apply in your actual camera one view, right?
Correct. That only applies to your camera view. In your other views, you'll be able to see where your focus distance is, and you'll be able to rack focus from one object to another object using that focus distance.
I will give you an example. All right, so in my setup, I've got this tree on the right-hand side that's closer to my camera. So if I use the focus distance and pull it in, you'll notice that I can rack focus from that tree to another tree. And another really helpful thing is to be able to see where that focus distance is in relation to all your different layers, right? So if I go to the viewport section and I go to the top view, I can see, if I zoom out, I can see this is the focus distance line right here on the camera. So you can see that when I move the focus distance, it moves that line, right? So whatever that line is intersecting is going to be in focus, right? So right now this tree in the front is in focus. If I move that focus distance line way back, say to that middle tree, when I go to my active camera, is going to be in focus, where everything else is soft. Cool, right? Dude, now I can do total camera moves inside of After Effects. How awesome.
Oh boy.
Shoot, did you have a question, Luke?
No, I didn't. I'm just excited like you.
Awesome. Okay, so now we've got depth of field turned on, and we've got focus distance working for us. Let's just do a really simple camera move and start playing around with how this camera is moving in 3D space. So, and like I said, when I say, like a good mentality to take with After Effects and cameras is just keep it simple. All right, so all I'm going to do is just a simple like left to right camera move. The point of interest, I can set that where I want it to go and then move the camera left and right, and it's going to give us this great 3D parallax effect. So first thing I'm going to do is go back to my top view, and what I want to do is I kind of want to make sure that my point of interest is on that bird, my birds on the trees tree. And it looks like it's pretty close to where I want it. So I'm going to move it just towards the camera ever so slightly, and I'm going to check the active camera view just to kind of make sure where things are looking. I kind of want it to kind of focus on where those birds are at. And now I'm arbitrarily moving this around. I know that it's lined up in terms of Z space. I'm just kind of setting the point of interest where I want it to be on that tree itself. All right, so ideally what I want to have happen here is I want my birds to be the point of interest. And now I can create a camera move. So this is just like moving a layer around in After Effects. You guys know how to set an in and set an out key, and we can move the camera from point A to point B. So I'm at 0 seconds right now. I'm just going to go ahead and turn on my keyframe for my position. And over the course of 5 seconds, and I'm going to set my end work area down here, I'm going to have this camera move to the right. Over the course of 5 seconds. And I'm just going to play this back for you. So here's what we get. And you can see that render times definitely go up. So I'm rendering at half resolution, 50%, and it took definitely more than 5 seconds to render that out. But you get this gorgeous parallax, right? That's like the be-all, end-all. That's what people want to see in all their shots. You want that awesome parallax effect. So for good parallax, what do you need?
Foreground, background.
Foreground, middle ground, background. Perfect, David. Yep, you need to put objects in the foreground so that you can tell that there's motion in the foreground. You need to have objects further away in the background so that you can see that the objects are parallaxing against each other. So in whichever direction the camera is moving, the foreground and the background are going to move opposite to each other, right? The stuff way off in the distance is going to look like it's moving opposite to the stuff in the foreground. Awesome. Now we can have even more fun with that. Like I could take and I could do a focus distance animation, right? Basically pull focus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have, and I would probably reverse this, but I'm going to have my camera kind of rack focus here right at the end. So I'm going to set a keyframe on my focus distance, and over the course of a second, I'm going to have the rack pull forward and focus on this tree in the foreground. And maybe let my animation run just a little bit longer. All right, now I get this. La-di-da-di-da. Sorry for people who are watching this lecture at home for the render times. I'm just too lazy to pause it. All right, so you can see we get this gorgeous parallax, and we can start having a lot of fun with actually working with the lens of the camera and using rack focus and things like that to great effect.
Can you go to your top view real quick?
You bet. So if I go to the top view, this is what I see. I will pull the camera out a little bit.
So it's the very last image. Where is that at on your...
Oh, okay, so here's one thing that will really help you inside of when working in 3D, right? So you can probably barely pick out these little brown lines right here.
Yep.
Those are my additional tree layers, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the additional trees, and I'm going to turn them into a color that I can actually see. I like fuchsia. It's really bright. It's easy to pick up when you're in the top view and you can actually see where things are. So if I just scrub over my shot, you can see the focus distance move and come up to the tree in the foreground, right? I'm going to make my tree with birds another color. I'll make this one green so that I can pick that out too. Pink, I always leave the cameras pink I could turn the camera another color, like make it, you know, cyan or whatever, just so it's a little easier to see my pink layers. But you can see focus distance pulling from one tree to the next. You can see the camera moving, all that good stuff.
So that only shows you like the most in focus point, right? You can't show like the depth of.
There is no depth of field on those alternate views. The
Okay.
only one that renders depth of field is the active camera view, right? Play this out one more time so you guys can see what it looks like. I mean, it looks like I probably need to reposition a little bit because my tree's cut off on the left. But you get it, yes?
Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Quick
Luke.
question. This I don't know if we're gonna get into it or not, but is there any way we can artificially add some sort of depth to the image? Because right now they are obviously all 2D images.
Yep.
But is there any way that we could, have the camera go around it, and instead of seeing a 2D image, it could actually have some sort of width to it? I don't know.
Unfortunately, no.
No. Okay.
So this is not true 3D, right? It's 2.5D. We have 2D images in 3D space,
Okay.
right? So we can't just magically take a tree and make it round with branches sticking out in every direction. There are like little like stupid things that you can do to kind of fake it.
Okay.
So I'll just try that. You can kind of see what it's going to look. And this is actually the way they used to do this in old 3D games. Is they'd take a 2D image and just rotate it and intersect them, right? And now you've got a 3D tree, even though it's not really 3D.
Or it would always face the camera.
Or it would always face the camera, exactly. So let's say I'm just going to take and solo one of these layers here. I'll take this big tree in the middle. Where is it? That one. So I'm going to solo the big tree. I'm going to shut depth of field off for right now just so I can see what's going on. So I take that big tree. I'm going to change the color too to something I can see a little bit easier. If I take that big tree and duplicate it and then rotate this, say 90 degrees, and kind of just line it up a little bit. I'm going to go into my custom view here really quick just so I can fly a camera around and you can see what's happening. All right, so this isn't a terrible way to kind of fake what Luke is talking about. So right now I'm looking at the tree on the 45, right? And if I take and rotate my camera around it, it does kind of feel a little bit more 3D, right? And obviously this isn't lined up very well. You can see that this is kind of messed up on the Z space. So I take and just kind of like cross that right away in the center. It looks pretty good. So you could kind of get away with that.
Okay.
What I would say you'd probably want to do is get a couple different versions of the tree that are close to the same size, so you have different branches on different intersections and stuff like that. Or like flip or reverse the image depending on what you want to do. You could take this a step further and maybe duplicate it one more time, and say offset this again by call it a 60-degree turn, and now you get even a little more out of it. You obviously can't push it too far because it's just going to look like a bunch of flat images all like rotated with the same branches and everything. But if that's something that you're looking to try to do, that's kind of the quick and cheat way to do it.
Okay.
All right, cool. Let's take 15 minutes, go on a break, come back at 7:20, and we'll start working with lights, shadows, color, all kinds of stuff like that. Go ahead.
Peace out, boys.
All right, here you go. Such a lightweight.
I got lost.
Get some sacking goes.
Little sackage, Leah.
Absolutely.
Little polka sack on this. It sounds like a cut.
Here we go. Let's cut the music. I would love to listen to music in class, but it interferes with recordings, unfortunately. All right, let's do this. Okay, so we have some cool looking stuff inside of our project. Yeah, we can hit the lights real quick. Or was I here? Cancel that. All right. So we got some trees, we got a ground plane, we got a really simple, dead simple camera move. We got depth of field working for us. Like we're well on our way to like doing really cool stuff with 3D space and 2.5D objects. I'm just gonna back up a few steps and get rid of this tree that I was kind of full 3Ding. And we learned that it doesn't really work that way, unfortunately, in After Effects. It's 2.5D, but you can still do a lot of amazing stuff in 2.5D space. Okay, so here we go. The next thing that we're going to learn about is lighting and shadows. So one of the cool things about After Effects 2.5D is you can do full 3D lights, which is great. You can do omnis, you can do spots, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff. So let's start playing around with lighting. I'm going to go back to my active camera view. I've got my kind of faux move set up here. I'm gonna tweak this just a little bit to kind of get it to the point where I'm happy with the move. Everything looks good. Obviously, we can see the edge of my tree there, and that's not gonna fly really. So I'm gonna fix that just by taking my tree with birds and moving it a little bit to the left so that my shot looks nice when we rack focus. Good, good, good. Cool. Okay, so this shot is, I'm going to look at this at full res real quick just to make sure that yep, that's popping. All right, good. All right, so this shot's looking pretty good. We got some movement, rack focus, our 3D space is kind of built up nicely. Now we're going to cap it with some good lighting. So let's start playing with lights. Lights are made the same way that you make a camera. So you go composition, or you go layer, new, light, and it's going to pull up this light rollout for you, and we'll step through that. Everybody's with me, right? Everybody's got a light rollout?
Definitely.
Excellent. Okay, so obviously we got the light types first and foremost. We got parallel. Parallel lights are basically like a light that shoots a parallel beam of light all across your entire scene in the same direction, right? So if you build a parallel light and you set it up, it's going to act a lot like kind of a sun would, right? Where all the shadows kind of fall in the same direction and it covers your whole scene. Spotlight. Spotlight's pretty self-explanatory. It makes a light that is a spot, right? You can control the light cone, you can control the feathered edge, and you can make the light shine on whatever you want it to shine on inside of your scene. Point light is the same thing as like an Omni light in Maya or 3D Studio Max or C4D. It basically shoots light in all directions from a single point, and you can move that point around wherever you want inside of the scene. And then you've got ambient. Ambient doesn't have a specific point of light. It's basically giving light everywhere in the scene, in the shadows, at all times. It doesn't cast light, it kind of is light, if that makes sense. So we're going to kind of play around with a few of these different light types, just so you guys can see what's going to happen. We're going to start learning how to control shadows, not only on the trees, but on like where shadows are falling, how to control shadows inside of After Effects. And that will get us pretty much to where we need to be, where you guys are armed with everything you need to move forward with your assignments. So in the final part of the class, what we'll do too is we'll cover the whole PDF thing, because I know you guys had some questions about what I'm looking for in terms of how you should be designing your little PDFs for moving forward with your project. So we'll get there too. All right, so let's start with ambient, just so you guys can kind of see how these different lights act. So I'm going to kind of set this lighting up so that it's nice and moody. I want lights to hit in certain places, but I want to kind of give it an ambient light too, so that you can see all the stuff inside of my composition. So with ambient light, generally it's a good idea to start low and work up, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to an intensity of 10%, and I'm going to set the color to like a nice dramatic blue. And I'm going to click OK and OK. And you'll notice right away, like, oh, well, why I can't see anything. Why is this? It's craziness. I'm going to push it a little bit just so you can start to see. So right away, we've got a much more moody looking image, right? I've got this really dark blue ambient light playing inside my scene. And you can see if I keep turning this up, it just starts to look like everything was color casted blue, right? So I'm going to just back this off and make this really subtle. I'm at like about 50%. The reason it's so dark is because I used a really dark color. Like if I use a brighter color, it's going to be a lot brighter, obviously. So you can kind of dial it in just depending on how saturated your light is, how dark you want it, and how much lightness there is in the color that you pick. So right now I've kind of got my ambient light set to about 20%. It's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and let's add in a parallel light. And and the way I'm going to think about this parallel light is it's going to be kind of like a moonlight. And I'm going to use it as a backlight so that the shadows fall forward towards the camera. So let's go up to layer new and make a new light and set the type to parallel. The color on this one, I want this to be like a bluish moonlight. I want it to kind of match or be in the same hue as my ambient light. So I'm just gonna kind of go for just like a light blue like that. Intensity, I'm gonna set the intensity on this to 90%. So that's gonna kind of fill in the rest of the lighting inside of my scene. I want to make sure that cast shadows is turned on, and I'm gonna set the shadow darkness to, I'm gonna set it to 80%. So I'm gonna get these nice rich dark shadows with the parallel light. Go ahead.
Does negative intensity take away the color from the scene?
I believe negative intensity is actually 0.
Oh, there's just, okay. But
I know it goes negative.
Okay. It doesn't do anything.
But I've never really experimented too much with negative
Okay.
intensity. So that's an interesting question.
Okay.
What I try to do is when I'm working with lighting inside of After Effects is I try to keep everything in kind of a 100% range, right? And I'll tweak all of my lights to kind of fit that. You know, like with anything, you can add more and more light to the stuff, but it just starts overexposing, and you start losing detail. So I try to keep everything in 100% range. So if I'm doing, like, let's say I'm doing ambient light, my ambient light's set to 20. I'm gonna set this to 80 so that I got a number of 100 when it comes to the very end. So I'm gonna click OK, and you'll notice right away now we have this new light in our scene. And crazy stuff is starting to happen. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this to my custom view. So I can see kind of where my light is, where my cameras are, all this good stuff. So right now my parallel light is kind of set in front of my trees, and it's casting backwards. And what I want this light to do is I want my light to cast the other direction. So if you take and kind of use your custom view and your move tool, you can kind of make the light, and you don't actually have to move the physical point of the light because the parallel light is always casting light in a specific direction, right? So you really only need to move that point of interest around, and it will cast the light in whatever direction you tell it to, basically. So I'm just going to tweak this a little bit, and then we're going to go in and we're going to start setting up the shadows. All right, that's looking pretty good. All right, so right now, all of the layers inside of our After Effects project are set so that they don't cast shadows, and obviously we want to fix that. So, yeah, go ahead, David.
Lock the point of interest so it doesn't move.
This point, you can lock the layer. So once you've got your well, you don't really have it dialed in quite yet because we can't see shadows.
So like if the camera's facing one way and I just want to, or the light's facing one way and I just want to go to the other side.
Move the point of interest.
No,
I would
keep
recommend
the
just
point
kind
of
of.
interest the same, just but like go. The light's coming from the opposite.
No, you actually have to move the point of interest to make that light move in a different direction. So the light with a parallel light is casting towards the point of interest.
Yeah.
So wherever that point of interest is, that's the directionality of the light itself. So you don't actually have to move the point. Moving the point does nothing. Moving the point of interest, or the direction in which the light is cast, is everything with the parallel light.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, so let's get shadows working, right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to turn shadows on. So one thing I'm going to do here real quick is I'm going to go into all of my 3D layers, and I'm going to, well, let's just make it simple. So let's look at one layer first, just so you guys can see how this is going to work. So select one of your trees. Let's pick one that actually intersects with the ground. I have that one tree kind of hanging off by itself. I don't really care about that shadow so much as I care about the shadows that are going to be cast by the trees in the background. So I'm going to pick this one tree, and let's just go in and look at how the shadows and options are working with this layer. So whenever you make a layer 3D, you get 3 options in terms of position, rotation, blah, 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 stuff like that, because you're working in Z space now, as well as X and Y. But you also get material options. So let's open up that material options. How many of you have worked with a 3D program before? Okay, a lot of you. So when I say materials, you understand what I mean when I say materials. So this is After Effects' kind of dumbed down version of what materials are in a 3D program. So right away you can see there's some options. Cast shadows, we want to turn that on. So as soon as I turn that on, now I got this beautiful long cast shadow that my parallel light is now creating on my scene. Right, everybody sees that, right? That this one tree is now casting this nice long shadow. See it? Watch. I'll turn it on and off. So when you turn cast shadows on, now that parallel light is casting those nice shadows on my newspaper ground. And there's 3 options with cast shadows. You can have cast shadows on for a layer. So if a light hits it, it's going to cast a shadow on whatever is accepting shadows. You'll see down there we've got accept shadows is on. If you turn it off for a specific layer, it won't cast shadows anymore. So we want to make sure that cast shadows is on, accepts lights is on. If you want certain layers to not be affected by your lights, that's a great way for you to single layers out. Maybe you've colorized something in After Effects or in Photoshop to look exactly the way you want it to look, and you don't want your lights to affect it, but you want it to cast shadows. There's a whole bunch of options here. So I want this to both accept light, I want it to accept lights, accept shadows, and cast shadows. So we want to turn that on, we want to turn those options on for all of those layers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of go through and I'm going to select all of my 3D layers that I want my shadows working on. And all I need to do is open one of the layers once they're all selected. So open up the caret, go into the material options, turn cast shadows on, and you'll notice now I have a whole bunch of shadows cast on my newspaper. And we want accept lights and accept shadows for all those different layers. And now we have these really cool shadows being cast in our image. So here's a great look at what things are looking like with our shadows cast.
What if your shadows go the other way?
You can change the directionality of your parallel light to make the shadows cast whatever direction you want them to go. So if I say take my parallel light and open up the options, the point of interest is what you're looking at. So whenever you move the point of interest, your shadows are going to change direction, right?
The point of interest for
the parallel light, for the parallel light. Right? So wherever that point of interest is, it changes the lighting and the directionality of the shadows. Right? So now what kind of awesome shit can we do? We can make a sunrise or set. We can have shadows fall in any direction we want. We can do all kinds of really cool stuff by controlling light and shadow. So play with your parallel light a little bit. Set it up in a way that fits the mood of the scene that you're going for. All right, so we have an ambient light, we have a parallel light, it's casting shadows on the ground, they're looking nice and stark and interesting, and we're starting to see some really cool effects happen with our image. I wonder, is there fall off? Ooh, there is. Okay, so let's look at some more options inside of our parallel light real quick so you guys can get an idea of the other options that you have to work with. So one of the cool aspects of light is fall off, right? You guys have heard of the inverse square lighting rule, where like the farther away you get from the light, the less intense the light is, right? If you're sitting right next to it, it's gonna be really hot and in your face, but if you move 30 feet away, the lighting falls off over time. Well, you can do that same thing inside of After Effects by playing with the light. So you can set your lighting fall off to inverse square clamped, and you'll notice that it gives you some interesting fall off effects. You can set it to smooth, and it will fall off in certain distances. So when you start playing with fall off, you need to start controlling the radiuses and the distance of your fall off for specific effects, right? So if I increase the radius of my fall off, it's kind of giving me this nice like circle of light falling on the ground in my scene. If I increase or decrease the fall off distance, the distance of the fall off increases or decreases.
How do I do it so like this tree merges to like a cloud?
So if you want to, you can play around with how your lights fall off. It can come in handy for kind of occluding certain parts of your image if you want to kind of create some occlusion with your lighting. All right, so we've played around a little bit with these different effects that we have. You've also got your shadow, your shadow darknesses. You might want to play around with that. Like if I set my shadow darkness to 30, the shadows go away quite a bit. If I crank that up to say 100, I'm just going to get these really rich black shadows on my ground. So play around with some of those options and see what happens with different settings. And then let's go ahead and add a point or a spotlight. So I've got a parallel, I've got an ambient, and now I can really start dialing in what my scene looks like with different lighting effects, right? So you can see that when I start playing with my ambient light, it gives me some pretty interesting effects. If I shut it off or crank it up, we can start dialing in all these different lighting settings to really make our image interesting. I'm going to set that back to 20%. Kind of liking where that was. All right, now let's add a spotlight. So let's go up to Layer, New, Light. Let's add a spot this time. And I'm going to make this a nice warm color. I'm going to kind of focus this in on my little lovebirds in the tree. So I'm going to go for kind of a tungsten light, an orange or amber light. Nice and bright in terms of color with a little bit of a tungsten cast to it. Click OK. My intensity is set to 80%. I'm going to set that to about 50, and I can play around with this stuff later. Cone angle, you've got feathering, fall off, shadows, all kinds of good stuff. I'm going to leave the shadows on for the time being. I might turn them off depending on what's happening. And I'm going to click OK. And everything's going to change. All right, so now I have this big giant spotlight in my image. Now this will actually work really well with position. So you can use these lights, move them around, create all kinds of interesting effects with your lights by changing not only the position but the point of interest, so where the light is pointing. So for this, I kind of want to get my point of interest right on those little lovebirds in my tree. And I really want to spot this down so that it's just illuminating the birds in the tree. So I'm going to go into my light, my spotlight, and go into my light options. And I'm going to start playing around first with the cone angle. So if I bring the cone angle way down, you can see that this really does start to spot out and do exactly what I want it to do. And you can start playing around with your point of interest. And this is really what I want. I want these birds to be illuminated. And I'm definitely going to go for some fall off here because I don't want my light to be hitting those trees in the background per se. I just want them to really hit those birds and then fall off to nothingness. I'm going to play around with the position a little bit. Lift my light up in the air. So that it's falling down on the ground. I can play around with its Z positioning a little bit just to help it out. If you want to, you can come in here and change the colors a little to make it colorize. The other thing you can play with is the cone feather. So the more feathered that cone is, the softer that spot's going to get. You can make it a really hard spot by setting your cone to 0. If you actually saw this on the ground, I'll move the point of interest down to the ground. See if we can get that. I'm going to turn the fall off real quick. You can see that I get this really, I'm going to go to a different view here so you can see this a little bit better. But we get this really nice spotted light. Like if I solo this light and crank up its intensity a little bit, you can see now we just got this really nice harsh spot, right? You can kind of see what happens when you start feathering the edge out. Gives you this nice soft feathered light. Go back to my active camera. Lift this up a little bit. So right away, I mean, just look at the cool effects you can get in just playing around with lights. Like this is a very interesting looking image just with this one light in it. And you can come back in here and just start playing around with intensities and fall offs and things like that to really dial in how you want your light to look. So, all right, so now let's play around with this a little bit more, have a little more fun with this. I'm going to go ahead and just render out what I have with no animation. Or, heck, I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to do a little bit of light animation here. I'm going to shut off depth of field because depth of field is going to take a ton of render cycles, and I just kind of want to be able to see what's happening with my lighting. So I've got, I like my spot a lot, so I'm going to start with the spotlight, and I'm just going to animate my intensities. So I'm going to set my intensity. I'm going to have this spotlight kind of turn on over the course of 1 second. So go from 0 to 100% intensity. We'll get to, it'll kind of, show us the little birdies there. I'm going to go ahead and play with my ambient and parallel lights just a little bit. Ambient light, I think I'm going to drop back by 10%, so it's not quite so harsh. I'm going to get a little bit more color out of my trees. Good, looking good. My parallel light is pretty dialed in. Kind of happy with how that's looking. And now I'm going to just kind of play around a little bit with lighting over time. All right, so if I play this back, this is kind of what I get with my lighting over time. And you'll notice that the render times have now really gone up astronomically. Like, we're waiting a long time for renders.